We are back on Morning Line. Thanks for joining us. This is malpractice attorney Clint Kelly. It's good to have him on with us. The number 737-7587. So many things to consider when you talk about going to the hospital, the doctor. Clint, at some point, has got me sometimes very wary about where I go and how I go. Thankfully, I've learned an awful lot from you. You hear about situations. We were talking about an orthopedic surgeon down in Florida. And the details, it made headlines a couple weeks ago. You actually pointed out the story to me.
Yeah.
Tell folks how
Michelle
this
said
played
it
out.
to me, and I read it. It's long story short, and this is, of course, this is what we read now. I don't have any personal knowledge of this, but that was an orthopedic surgeon who was botching surgeries on a fairly regular basis and was starting to have mental issues, and the two probably were tied together.
Yeah.
But what was so concerning and disappointing is that the hospital and the staff were either in one case masking this, pretending it wasn't happening, or disguising it in such a way so that people wouldn't find out it was happening because this guy was a big earner. You know, and that's the thing to remember about surgeons at hospitals. They generate a ton of money for hospitals because the hospitals are used, the facilities are used as the home for the surgeries, the OR suites. And so every time there's a surgery, the hospital gets its cut. And so these surgeons who have a lot of surgeries, as you can imagine, generate a lot of revenue for the hospital. So the last thing the hospitals want to do is lose a good earner. And apparently that's what this guy was. And finally it reached a breaking point and word got out about this guy. But by the time that he had lost his privileges, no telling how many patients had been injured as a result of this guy's negligence.
Okay, so just take me into the OR. All right, here you have a guy, and you have these nurses and assistants that are watching and assisting him in the process, and they've seen many surgeries in the past, and they have to see, just as I would in the newsroom if there's a reporter doing something that I know is just not right, because I'm in the biz and I know it, I'd notice it.
Right.
Okay, so they're watching and they're saying, wait, he's using the wrong scalpel here. What's he doing to the bone there? I mean, they had to see this, and no one says anything?
Let me give you an example of a case I do have personal knowledge of, and that was a surgeon who was practicing at a local hospital, one of the counties around Nashville, who was showing up at the OR drunk and was operating on patients. And this went on for a period of time. In some cases, the nurses were able to detect it and stop the surgeon from operating. In other cases, they would try to bring in another surgeon to work with that surgeon. They brought it to the attention of the administration, and it took a number of different, let's just say, raising up the flagpole, other opportunities to do that before finally the hospital took the bull by the horns and sent this guy off to a drunk farm. That's what we call it in our business, to get him cleaned up, to get him sober. I don't know whatever happened to him after that, but I do know that he blinded my patient. And the fact of the matter is that this is not uncommon. People don't like to know about that. It's not uncommon.
I guess I want to know about it. My question is, how do you prevent it? When you know you're going in for some kind of procedure.
There is no way. There is no way for a patient to know. The whole system is built towards confidentiality.
Right.
For one, okay? And also, they want to protect the doctor and the hospital in that regard. So the patient's not going to find out unless there is a major mistake and they're sued. And what happened in my case, do you know how I found out? I had no idea. Okay. I knew that I had a case of negligence, and I knew it wasn't too hard to prove because
your client had gone blind, and you're like, something went wrong here.
There was a horrible mistake. It was not hard to figure out. This guy was operating in the wrong place, wrong time.
But you didn't know why.
Didn't know why. Because he seemed like a respectable surgeon to me. I get a call 1 month before the trial date from a nurse who tells me this doctor has got an alcohol problem and is no longer operating at the hospital.
Well, so they had finally taken action.
He had voluntarily gone to get treatment.
Wow, that's kind of like a pretty big phone call. What did you do when you heard that? You're
I settled the case within a week. And I'm not saying I would have tried it without that, but I'll say that information, you know, of course I had called the defense lawyer. It's part of my job.
So, okay, so you get this and you call them and you say, I know we're scheduled to trial in a week, but do you know? And they had to have known this. They were hoping you wouldn't
Clint,
find
I'm going to have to check on this. And then within a couple of days, we mediated the case, we got it settled.
And then gosh, if that had come out in court?
Well,
I mean, you're going to win that for sure, right?
That would have been a big question, would have come out in court. I don't know if I ever could have proven without an eyewitness there that he was drunk when he operated on my patient. The fact of the matter is, you do the math, Nick, when someone has an addiction problem, they generally don't skip a day or two. They stay on whatever the chemical or the alcohol, the drug of choice is. And in this case, this guy was showing up regularly under the influence. And see, they can smell it. On the physician. And so when the physicians get cleaned up, they'll come back, they'll make the physician give a urine test to ensure that they're not under the influence to allow them to keep practicing. But this happens, and you asked, going back to the question, what can a patient do about it? There's nothing, because there's no way to report that unless someone who works with that doctor or healthcare provider is brave enough to say something about it.
What do you think was the motivation behind this nurse a week before trial calling you?
I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, that's a godsend, but I mean...
It is. Nick, I didn't get a name.
Could be any number of reasons.
I knew.
She sounded credible. She goes, look, I'm a nurse.
She was, yes, there wasn't a question.
And you're like, you got the detail. Wow.
Yeah.
That's something else, getting a call like that. All right, so...
but going back to this orthopedic surgeon in Florida, the central question is this. These surgeons, and it always seems to surround them, generate so much revenue for the hospitals that they're given a lot of latitude. And you know, there's something to be said about people who have impairments. I mean, they have a disease, they need to get treatment. You know, everyone wants them to get better. The problem is, until that surgeon gets treatment, they're dangerous. They're like a drunk driver. And the odds are they're going to hurt somebody, because there's only so often they can go without making a major mistake that either costs a life or, in my client's case, blinds my client. And you know, there's not a whole lot a patient can do other than to come to somebody like me to pick up the pieces, because you can't find that stuff out on the front end.
So the big picture for people like us who haven't gone through something like that, the only thing to keep hospitals maybe honest on that front are attorneys like you, that when it does happen, they pay through the nose and they say, we can't have this happen again. Let's stop covering for them.
Correct. I mean, like, if it's happened before, word usually gets around. You know, this doctor had a problem, and if the doctor's back, people tend to know it, and it's just, people gossip, you know, and that's how you find out things. There's some, I mean, the vast majority of doctors have no problems whatsoever, and you just know that they're not going to be an issue, but there's some that you just hear through the grapevine. The scary thing, though, is some of these doctors, they move out of state. They're basically kicked out of the hospital, and they have to start up somewhere else. Well, if they go from Tennessee to North Carolina, or maybe to Massachusetts, you're not going to know, if you're a Massachusetts patient, anything about what happened in Tennessee.
But don't... Okay, I guess you would.
See what I mean?
Yeah, and let's be clear that how often the surgeons don't always necessarily work for the hospital. Is it kind of like they lease the OR rooms if you're an independent surgeon? You have an office maybe near a hospital complex, and you have an agreement with the hospital that I will perform surgeries here. You get a portion because I'm using your OR, but I'm independent. Meaning it's not like hospitals are vetting these surgeons necessarily.
They're supposed to.
Oh.
You have a duty. I'm glad you brought that up. Every hospital has a duty to a patient to properly credential a surgeon, and that includes making sure that surgeon is sober.
How about making a call to their past employer, or not employer, past hospital where they had a partnership?
Process. It's part of it. So, you know, we would have had a theory, had it ever been an issue in that case I was telling you about with the doctor who was the drunk, to find out why that hospital allowed this man to continue to operate, you know, and what investigation, if any, did they do once it became apparent that he was showing up to the hospital inebriated. Again, the hospital has a duty there to make sure that the physician is competent to perform the procedure. Because you're right, in essence, the hospital, I wouldn't say they lease out the OR, but it's their OR. That's the premises where it's...
And is it their nurses, or is it the doctor's nurses?
Yes, it's their nurses.
It's their nurses, their OR.
The doctor may have a surgical assistant with his practice, but in general, the nurses are employed by the hospital, and basically everybody is in general, except for the surgeon. You know, when you have surgery, you get 2 bills, actually 3, don't you?
Yeah, right.
Hospital, anesthesia, surgeon.
Anesthesia? Many cases with regard to that?
Generally not employed by the hospital.
I know. And do you come across malpractice cases with anesthesia? Rare.
Very, very
And they're
rare.
you underestimate. Anesthesiologists, they make good money. It's very important. I mean, you can make the argument there's no one much more important than the
Nick, I can tell you, in my practice, I've been doing this for 30 years. Every anesthesiologist I've run into has been conscientious and good at what they do.
Very good at what they do. And it's crucial. That's what knocks you out and brings you back.
When they do informed consent, they actually sit down with you and go through all the things that can happen as a result of anesthesia. I mean, they go through it face to face with you, so you know exactly what you're doing. That's a whole lot better than I know some surgeons do.
Where they don't walk you through it. And did you say in the past too, if they don't do that, you have to ask? What would you say? You go in, you're gonna have a surgery. Let's say you got knee surgery coming up. They're not coming in. The surgeon's not.
That's the surgeon's duty. Now, he can delegate it. He can delegate that responsibility to what they call a physician extender, maybe a nurse practitioner, to go over the information. But that surgeon ultimately owes that duty to disclose all material risks about the surgery to the patient. That's not the patient's job. How the hell would the patient know?
Well, see, yeah, I don't know. And even when they start telling you all these, okay, so they're sitting there giving me informed consent. What am I going to say? Okay, you're telling me all these things that can happen. No, I don't want to have this done. You're going to, of course, have it done.
9 times out of 10, of course. I mean, unless they tell you something that really makes you nervous. I think the more scary issue is when they tell you you're at higher risk in this surgery than other patients I have. So you need to know that you're more susceptible to having a bad outcome, complications, than other patients. And then telling you, hey, you don't have to have this. There is an alternative. You can have a conservative measure, you can have a different procedure, or you can do nothing. Now, if it's an emergency, we all know, of course, you're going to have it. But most often it's elective. And it's the surgeon's obligation to tell the patient
what
risks,
the odds are, risks,
alternatives, or if nothing's done.
As an attorney who does this on a regular basis, sees it all the time, how great is your threshold for risk depending on the circumstance and the condition? How high would you go? If they say there's a 30% chance of a bad outcome, is that too much?
It depends on how bad I need it, doesn't it?
There you go. It depends on whether or not it's totally elective. If I'm having something just relatively minor or whatever, I don't want, the risk has got to be minuscule.
Sure.
But, obviously if they're like, if you don't have this done, you're going to die, well, I'm going to take my shot.
But I want to know.
Yeah, but I want to know.
And the law entitles me to know so that I can make an informed judgment, because knowledge is power.
Yeah.
It's part of what I'm owed. It's part of what you pay for. When you pay a doctor or a surgeon for a service, you're paying for advice and consent.
Right. Take a break on that note. Back with more with Clint Kelly right after this.